legalisefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalisefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalisefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt and my guest today is Luke Dodson. In 2023, a full spectrum assault on the human psyche is underway, from freedom of movement to freedom of thought and speech, and all points in between. A 24/7 media matrix is manipulating minds into believing the very opposite of the truth. Black is white, left is right, up is down, male is female. Campaigns of propaganda and censorship, in lockstep with networks of control and surveillance, are creating an insidious climate of fear and permanent crisis. The aim is to undermine, demoralise and break down families, communities and entire nations, leaving people isolated, impoverished and weakened both mentally and physically. It is nothing less than a war on independence, on identity and on reality itself. Hello and welcome, Luke, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalisefreedom.com.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Look, today we're going to be taking a somewhat askance view of current events, personal, national, global, trying to interpret the times that we're living through, maybe in somewhat alternative light. Before we get into that, I just want to tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your work, just so if they haven't heard any of our shows together before, just so they know who you are.
Sure. So my intellectual academic background was in the field of English literature. So at university, I was looking at the way language works. And in the academic environment, that is often reasonably constrained in what you can do with that. But luckily, I managed to not end up in the ivory tower of academia. Not that there's anything intrinsically wrong with it, but the way it's going these days is a little bit dicey for free-thinking people, as I know many academic friends of mine can tell me. But I have been putting that to use in the past sort of 3 years or so, getting back into writing and looking at the way in which language shapes reality. And so I kind of started that in 2020, when a lot of the climate stuff was really kicking in terms of the Extinction Rebellion protests, and obviously the COVID pandemic had just been declared. And looking at the way in which words like green, sustainable, carbon neutral, net zero, these sorts of words have been manipulated and used and even coined in some cases to manipulate people's perceptions of reality. And further than that, widening it out to, ideas of transgenderism, transhumanism, the attack on farming, the sort of ongoing squeezing of everyday life and biological reality by a seemingly overwhelming social and political force. But that's a seeming, as we will probably get into today.
You're just talking about how the power of language shape reality, and of course, it really does. And we think in terms of language. If you're trying to work anything out, you so often, I don't know about you, but I'll basically hear my own voice talking inside my own head, working things through. And if you don't have a word for something, then in some ways it doesn't exist. And I also thought it was interesting when you say that the pandemic was declared. Not that it happened as such. I mean, whatever you think about the events, but you used the word it was declared, and it's kind of like, in a way, there wasn't a pandemic until the telly box in the corner said so. You know.
Yes. Well, this was the odd disconnect between people's lived experiences of reality and the linguistic framing, kind of narrative framing, it might be better to say, that was placed around it. So you would talk to people and they'd say, "Oh, it's really bad out there. The hospitals are overwhelmed, and I have a friend of a friend who works in the NHS, and she says that they're completely overwhelmed." You go, "Well, what about all these videos that are coming out of nurses that are dancing in empty corridors? What about the statistics that show that, in fact, that in 2020 anyway, was the death rates really weren't significantly different from the 5-year average or the 10-year average, or really it was perhaps not much worse than a normal perhaps a reasonably bad flu season." I'm not going to say for certain what was going on there. There are many different views on COVID and what it is, and whether it was even a virus.
But look, your problem is that you're reality based. You see. I can't remember which US politician said that. I know it was Karl Rove that said, the neocon infamous one. Kind of, when we act, we create our own reality. But there was definitely one of them talked about political or socio-political opponents being reality based, and this was like meant to be a smear on them, if you see what I mean. I'm going to refer, plug for my own stuff. I'm going to refer listeners to a couple of vlogs that I did during the pandemic phase. I mean, I did about a dozen, but one is entitled "Words Are Weapons, Don't Hex Yourself," which is about the power of language and how you can take a phenomenon or a thing, whatever it is, call it one thing, and that defines it. Call it something else, a different arrangement of the alphabet, and then in some people's minds, the thing itself changes. But of course, it can't. And the other video was COVID-19, where exactly is the pandemic? Question mark. And for me, that was so fascinating because I got a criticism for saying there wasn't a pandemic, but what I was exploring in that video was an idea that, I mean, I'd love to write a book on, which was, if I relied solely on the evidence of my own 5 senses, at no time did I see any evidence for a pandemic. Now, I realized, I said in the video, we couldn't travel very much. We couldn't travel very far. You certainly couldn't just walk into a hospital and check it out. There was a few journalists who tried that, and they got their comeuppance pretty fast when they tried just to walk in with a camera. But I was simply saying, no matter what took place around the country, around the world, no matter what the experiences of all these other billions of people, for me personally, and obviously some other people, I saw no evidence for it. And to me, that's just interesting. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just interesting that my eyes, my ears, my nose, it was like at no time during that was there evidence for it. Everything that would signal that there was something going on was media. Even if it was footage of people falling over in the streets in China or images of ambulances racing around the place, that's still what that was. And if you took it at face value, that in itself wouldn't constitute evidence. It wouldn't stand up in court, let's put it that way.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because now the evidence of something happening seems to be the number of people that are dropping dead or getting ill, or the number of gigs that have been cancelled because musicians are coming down with mysterious illnesses and such like. And in the local town nearest to me, last winter there was 2 people dropped dead of stroke related, sort of heart related cardiac incidents within the community of people who ran shops and their partners and wives and husbands and everything, and more people here and there. It's not like everyone, it's not like a sort of zombie apocalypse film, but it's just you suddenly go, there's a lot of people getting sick and dying at the moment, but the media's not talking about a pandemic. They're talking about all the other things that are apparently going on. So yeah, and that obviously that brings up the thorny issue of the vaccines, which we can go into. And I'm probably not the best person to speak to about it because I haven't really been paying much attention to the science. There are plenty of people who are at all the statistics or anything like that. Again, I'm just sort of going on my own gut instincts about these things and the number of people who seem to be getting sick, and that the whole, when the vaccines were announced, I immediately just went, oh, here we go. This is the thing that the crazies were warning about all along, and now it's happening. It's like,
I observed how, not saying that they were all somehow spot on, because a lot of them were obviously, fanatical nut jobs, but the evangelical preachers, Christian preachers in the US of the type that we saw in the 70s and the 80s, it was really interesting. As if you did a deeper reading of events around the pandemic, the measures and the restrictions that were brought in, particularly the idea of the mark of the beast, your COVID test on your phone, for example, or on your device, in order to be able to enter a shop or do anything like that and engage in life, how much that resembled the mark of the beast. So for all their faults, a few people observed, you say, oh, hang on, some of these guys, literal Bible thumpers, who were on cable TV, they actually got quite a lot of this right, and they sort of said it was coming, it was coming soon in the early 21st century specifically. So again, for me, that's just as someone interested in metaphysics and in deeper reality. That's just that's not me taking a position on any of this. Actually, I just think it's fascinating, to examine things, through these different lenses. It's because there's so much more going on, even the most mundane events. There's so much more going on, really, at different levels.
Yes, which brings us to the metaphysical dimensions of what's been going on, as we've been discussing together recently, and many of your recent conversations have been moving towards this as well, on legalized freedom. And a lot of mine as well with my blog. What's going on here behind the scenes? So, you have these evangelical Christian types that have been talking about a vaccine being the mark of the beast and the Book of Revelations coming true for quite a number of years. And then all of a sudden you've got all the churches kind of falling in line and saying, yeah, going to have all the vaccines, close the churches at the lockdowns and all this. There was even at Salisbury Cathedral, they had a kind of vaccine ritual where they played organ music and they opened it up as a vaccination center. And it was one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. So I can completely understand why people are looking for some sort of spiritual explanation, mystical, metaphysical explanation. And recently, Naomi Wolf got a lot of attention for this article she wrote about the ancient gods. Have the ancient gods returned? And I've written a response to it recently. And I'd also be interested to hear your own thoughts on that, as obviously you've had quite a wide range of people on your show, and you definitely aren't going to be constraining yourself to the line that this is one dogmatic vision of reality is the correct one, and that this is the right way, and anyone who doesn't follow this is that's just not really what you or I are really about. So I'm interested to hear your responses to people like Naomi Wolf kind of saying, well, it's because we turned our back on Yahweh.
Yeah, well, as you say, or as you've alluded to there, that's just one, way of looking at it within a certain religious or spiritual framework. I mean, I wouldn't agree with that, and there's lots of other people that might take quite narrow, specific positions on it that I wouldn't or couldn't agree with simply because I don't know. But yeah, I think it's just something about her worldview creeping into otherwise quite often, solid response to what's been going on. That's just her as a reflection of her personality as much as anything else, her psyche. And I know Thomas Sheridan took a guest on Legalized Freedom many times. He took issue with this because he was, as a pagan himself, he was really disappointed with her for like going down this route. But what she's tapping into is what you've been talking about, which is the metaphysics of this. So in that sense, she's on to something. But I think just sticking pinning it on a particular, pantheon or a particular spiritual or religious tradition is kind of missing the point, really. It doesn't go far enough. And in a way, it doesn't go deep enough. It just stops at a certain point, go, well, this is what it is. No. What she's arrived at is just hinting at what it might be. The idea that it was whether they were forces of nature or whether they're the planets, the heavenly bodies, whatever the ancient gods were. Maybe some of them were sentient biological creatures, we don't know. But whatever they were, I find it unlikely that whether they were beneficent towards human beings or whether they were vengeful and wrathful, whether they tormented human beings or whether they inspired them, that it would be down somehow to these entities doesn't really make sense for me. Entities, yes, but again, if people explore some of the recent material that you've written and some of the recent shows I've recorded, you can get more depth on this. Different people's, different researchers and writers' ideas about what might be going on. We've really only got time today to somewhat to generalize, I think, because there's so many potential theories, aren't they, about what the metaphysics of this might be.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned planetary bodies, and that reminds me that a lot of people in the sort of truther movement seem to have a real issue with Saturn, which I find really funny because, from a astronomical perspective, Saturn is a planet in the solar system. From an astrological perspective, Saturn is just another energy that is, no worse than any other, and indeed, approached with the right respect and caution, can be extremely beneficial and helpful. But the idea of Saturn seems to, or the idea of a kind of Saturn cult in the elites, which there might be, I suppose. But as I wrote something around Christmas time with reference to another blogger called Kimberly Steele, who's a very interesting woman, who I've had on my podcast as well. And both of us around that time were writing about the figure of Saturn as an imposer of limit, a force of limit, who within those limits can be very, very sort of generous, like Santa Claus. Santa Claus is the spirit of Christmas, and Christmas partly originates from Saturnalia, which is the celebration of Saturn and the celebration of the time when Saturn ruled, which the Romans thought was a golden age. So you've got this interesting, Saturn's an interesting figure, and what it seems to me is that if there's a Saturn worshipping cult amongst the elite, then I don't think they're worshipping him in a very good way, because basically they're doing an Ebenezer Scrooge. They're saying limits for thee, but not for me. You have to stay in your pod and eat the bugs, but we can fly around in our private jets and eat steak and have a great time just jetting around the world and hobnobbing with each other. And that Saturn doesn't go for that in astrological terms. He's a stern force, and anyone who sort of tries to exempt themselves from his wrath is going to feel it probably a lot more than others.
Well, I think the form that we're incarnated in, whether you believe in reincarnation or multiple lives or different levels of existence, this being just one of them, it would seem in many interpretations that this is the most limited form that we incarnate in. And life is nothing if not limitations. And the law of limits is one of the 7 laws in occult philosophy. It's very, very important. I mean, unlimited can be, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it, really, if you think about it in terms of anything. Unlimited abundance, is that a good thing? Unlimited suffering,
Yeah.
So limits are important. What you were saying about that in the context of global elites, whether political or corporate or whatever, and it's one law for one group and one for another, the other being you and I and pretty much everyone listening to this. A metaphysical interpretation of world events at the moment doesn't necessarily change the events. As I said, just you give it a different name or look at it differently. It doesn't change the thing, perhaps, but I think it really helps to potentially to understand, even if the metaphysical interpretation turns out to be incorrect. I think just looking, just lifting the lid on Pandora's box, I think is a worthwhile exercise. Even just doing that, admitting that there are other levels is really important. So we saw this after 9/11, in how the world changed. Really, we talk about the post 9/11 era. And I think we can very clearly see that there was an assault on the collective human psyche at that time, which we never really recovered from. You could say the same, for example, about the First World War and the Second World War, of course. And we went through this again with COVID. And I even did a video, COVID 9/11, a warning from history, drawing parallels, because having lived through 9/11, having got up on the morning of that day and saw on television what had happened, I knew instinctively straight away that the world would change no matter what, whether we all went to war or not. I knew this was something operating on multiple levels. The same with the pandemic phase. Of course, as that sort of eased, or certain restrictions eased and people were 5% less hysterical about it all, then things did feel better in many ways. I mean, even you and I, I'm sure, were just relieved to be able to just go about our daily business, with a little bit less restriction. But since that time, there has been, albeit it's more kind of atomized, it's more distributed, but the assault on the collective and individual psyche, the assault on reality, the assault on our sanity and on our bodies as well, is just as powerful, I believe, that it was during the pandemic phase. But it's not as focused on what's not laser-like. As I say, it's scattered. So we have all these issues that, you mentioned, the gender and trans issues, the woke kind of agenda, issues around, economy, energy, social problems, immigration, all sorts of cultural upheavals. Doesn't change those events, as I say, a different interpretation, but it's helpful, I think, when you're trying to get to grips with it. And if taken in the round, certainly it feels like some kind of social, cultural war. There's no doubt about it. I mentioned to you off air about my experience of news headlines. I don't read or watch the news anymore, but I still see headlines. And it's one thing after another. It really is sustained, unrelenting assault.
Yeah, it really is an assault of propaganda. And I think that's a really interesting way of putting it, that the whole thing has become much more dispersed. And I agree. What it feels like to me is that there's a certain pulling back and regrouping. So we had the 2020, which was this sort of, wallop, just bang, here's a thing to be afraid of. Stay in your homes until there's a vaccine. Here's the vaccine, 2 billion shots, 3 billion shots, whatever it is now. Now they're kind of like, oh, right, well, that thing's we probably milked that thing enough now. They're having to burn all these doses of the vaccine. The truth about the vaccines is still very much up in the air, but the evidence coming out doesn't look good, and it's increasingly coming out in the mainstream media. They're using people like Woody Harrelson, and to a certain extent Russell Brand, I think, not to impugn anything about their own personal motives, but it seems to me that they're being allowed a voice now in the mainstream public eye to voice questions about the pandemic, about the vaccines, as a kind of, what they call a limited hangout, a kind of like just slowly step back from that and let's regroup and find something else. Assuming that there isn't another faction or factions within the elite, within the media, info sphere, that aren't also trying to gain control by attacking that narrative. They may have been against it all along. Who knows? Nonetheless,
it's one thing to be against one elite group. It's another thing to be, in defense of, the wider society, the victims of said propaganda.
Yes, which is, why I won't sort of second guess the motives of these people within the mainstream who are talking about that, whether it's Andrew Bridgen or Russell Brand, or I just don't know, because I don't know these people personally, so I can't really get even a sort of embodied reading of them. But certainly feels like there's a pulling back and a regrouping. Right, where should we go next? What should we pull out next?
Yeah, it does feel like that, doesn't it? It's kind of like normal service or abnormal service will be resumed as soon as possible. In the meantime, here's some music, and that's all of the nonsense that we're seeing now. You mentioned Russell Brand. I think one of the reasons why, and David Icke sprang to mind straight away, I think one of the reasons why Icke has never, ever been even close to being allowed. I mean, the Channel 4 made that documentary a few years ago, actually, which was interesting. David Icke, was he right? But he's never even come close to being allowed that limited hangout because they just can't control him. Icke, having met him and worked with him for a while, I think he's a genuine article. No matter what you think of his views, I think he's a sincere guy, and I think someone like Russell Brand is absolutely controllable.
Yeah, there's a slickness about Russell Brand, isn't there? I've not met Russell Brand. I have come close to meeting him, and I know people who have met him, and yeah, I mean, his name says it all. He's the Russell Brand. He's a super slick communicator, quite an imposer in conversation. Sort of talks like this really fast, and he just steamrollers over everyone else, and just keeps going. Come on, mate, just chill out.
That's actually a very good impression.
Maybe I should go into Russell Brand impersonations in the yeah, we'll have an internet to work with in the future. Yeah.
Well, talking about some of the aspects of of current world events, and we've been talking about this metaphysical dimension, a lot of even at a superficial level, issues such as gender and trans and the woke thing, and immigration issues, a lot of social cultural, let's just say, seems to be built around, and you mentioned farming actually at the top of the hour. A lot of it seems to be about breaking down societal and cultural institutions, putting wedges within families, within communities, within entire societies, within countries, within certain, nationalities, with ethnicities. It's all about breaking, even, and then again within gender norms, which apply in the animal world as well. It's only we're starting to deny it in the human realm. So, but that it's really about breaking down solidarity, as I see it. So, individual sanity and kind of will, and morale, and then taking that and putting it right across the entire spectrum of society. So no matter what topic we could get onto here, that seems to be kind of what it's aimed at. Even all of the environmental proposals that are there, seemingly, to improve our living conditions and to clean things up and optimize them and make them sustainable. What that often amounts to in reality are measures that everyday people do not like. It's to their detriment. It may be allegedly to some beneficial end, but in the short to medium term, it's detrimental. and it's, it serves to undermine their morale and their ability just to live.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. One of the aspects of the sort of, I'll call it the current thing mindset, I don't want to call it normie or NPC because that's a little bit derogatory. I don't want to judge a type of person, or create a sort of, again, a schism, a division within society, which is what all of these campaigns are basically all about anyway. But the sort of the mindset of the current thing. I support the current thing, that meme that's quite popular these days, which sums it up so well, which is that there seems to be an unwillingness to really question whether the thing is as it's advertised. And you find this even amongst people who've previously have prided themselves on being free thinkers, non-conformists. Maybe they've even dabbled with 9/11 questioning, revisionism. I know quite a few people like that. There's quite a few people in the media like that. Matthew Bellamy from Muse springs to mind. I went through 9/11 denial for a while, but yeah, I just came out of it. Now I realize that it's all a load of conspiracy nonsense. It's that, right, well, I went through a phase of conspiracy theory when I was a teenager, and, it's kind of like being a goth or something. Like, it just, oh yeah, I did that for a while, and now I take things at face value because that's what nice, well-adjusted liberal people do. It clearly is about racism, this thing. It couldn't, if anyone questions it, then they must be a racist. Or, this thing clearly is about climate change and saving the environment. So if you question it, then obviously you don't care about the environment. And
well, there's a flip side to that, though, isn't there? That some things, if you do take them at face value, you end up with an interpretation completely at odds with the mainstream interpretation. So, calling a spade, for example, is like, oh, it's a spade. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. It's not a spade. That type of thing. So that works both ways, don't you find? That sometimes you'll see, you or I or anyone else might observe events or whatever and just say, oh, okay, well, taken at face value, this is what it is. But in order to fall in line with the sort of media propaganda interpretation, you have to see it as something other than what it actually is.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, bringing it back to the sort of denying the evidence of your own eyes and creating a wedge between your lived experience of reality and the narrative framing of it. So, there is a pandemic going on, even though I don't really see much evidence of a pandemic, but they say it is, say it's really bad. So it's got to be bad. So all those people who refuse to wear masks and get vaccinated must just really hate the elderly, and they just don't care about people and all the rest of it.
Well, we live in such black and white times, don't we? It's one thing or the other. Even though, we're often told, up is down, left is right, black is white.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the evidence of your five senses is very important. I've been stressing that, we both have, and we've been talking about looking beyond that. So for me, it's full spectrum. It's my five senses and it's my sixth sense. Work with as many, whatever tools you've got, whatever is at your disposal for interpreting reality as you experience it. Yet your five senses are vital, but also don't deny that which we are told has no validity, which is your gut sense, your intuition. That's so important. And the whole point is balance. And I think that we're living in very unbalanced times. If you rely solely on your intuition for everything, sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Ditto, if you only rely on your five senses or what's on the TV or what's on the internet, that's not going to serve you well all the time either. So it just seems like these things are mutually exclusive in many people's minds. Well, of course, they're not,
Well, I'm reminded of Jung's categorization of the personality types as being I think it's intuition, sensing, feeling, and thinking. And I can't quite remember I think sensing and feeling and intuition and thinking might be sort of two two binaries bunched together. But all of those, or however you pass out all of the epistemological means of apprehending reality, whatever reality is, that you kind of need to use them in a full spectrum way, as you say. You need a bit of intuition. You need a bit of, intellectual thought. You need to take what other people say on board. But you can't believe everything that they say either. If you just sort of only believe in your own interpretation of events, regardless of what other people tell you, regardless of what evidence comes up, and you just go out, then you end up, one of the people who wander up to you in the street and start telling you about how they just had a cup of coffee with Ringo Starr or whatever, and you're just completely on your own, but also you've got to have a little bit of willingness to step away from the apparent consensus reality, which often hasn't got much to do with reality these days.
No, that's certainly the case. As I said before, it's like there's the world of the news headlines and the what I call the hair helmet guy, which is, a newsreader or a politician who've got like one of those haircuts that looks like if they turn their head suddenly that the hair will stay in the same place. It's it's like it's just resting on there. So the hair helmet brigade tell us one thing, you look out the window, it's the other. It's like the rain is beating against the window, but your weather app on your phone says it's sunny. So which one are you going to go with? Well, one of the things about these, that again, some of the topics we've talked about, these very divisive topics, societal and cultural issues, is how things that really aren't issues become blown up into enormous issues, and how things that are very definitely major issues become verboten. You can only speak about them in a certain way, with a certain spin, a certain angle, come at it from a certain strand of opinion. So an example of the former would be the trans issue, affecting at most maybe 0.5% of the population anywhere in the world on average, usually a bit less than that. But that has become just the sort of, one of the issues du jour, the thing that you never ever stop hearing about. And whole careers are made and broken on this. Recently here in the UK, we had the leader of the Scottish National Party and the head minister in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, who recently resigned over this because she'd been trying to push a bill through the Scottish Parliament that would have allowed anyone, I think 16 and over, I think that's right, to basically go for, declare themselves to be whatever gender they wanted to be and enter into a surgical transition without actually proper medical consultation, and basically also without parental permission. And that was voted down, interestingly, and she resigned as a result. And today I noticed that the leader of the Labour Party in England, Keir Starmer, the very epitome of the hair helmet guy, is saying that Labour, who are currently in opposition, it's the Tories that are in power, so-called, Labour need to sort out their trans stance if they wish to win the next election. Now, I thought to myself, this could go either way. Either he means that they've got to, embrace the whole trans thing and say that, yeah, anybody can have their breast or their penis cut off or whatever, go for it. It's a free-for-all. Don't worry about what your parents think. Don't worry about consequences later in life. You want to do it when you're 6? Go for it. Or he means actually that he's looked at what happened to Nicola Sturgeon and he's thinking, could that happen to us? That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalisefreedom.com.
legalisefreedom.com